we're going to just crack straight on. My name's Helen Featherstone. I'm the Head of Public Engagement at the University of Bath. I'm hosting today's session. And with me today, we've got Immy, Jude and Tigist. So Immy, could I invite you to just introduce yourself and say where you're from and a little bit about what you are? Obviously, we're going to hear from you over the next 45 minutes. So over to you, please, Immy.
Thanks, Helen. Really great to be here today. I'm Immy. I am from somewhere called the Relationships Project. We're a small team on a mission to help build and nurture a field of practice around relationship-centred practice by helping to build the evidence base, develop useful tools and resources through which ideas and approaches can be shared, and make connections across the many brilliant people who are putting relationships first.
Great, thank you, Immy. Okay, and Jude, could I invite you to just introduce yourself and say what's your interest in relationship-centred practice?
Sure. So I am Jude. I'm an honorary fellow at the Open University and a research policy funding advisor, but I also coordinate a community-based research program in my local council estate and work very relationally across these spaces. And I think today I'm going to be speaking about a study that Tigist and I have been conducting for the University of Bath on welfare and well-being in relational research.
Thanks, Jude. And Tigist?
Hi, I'm glad to be here as well. My name is Tigist. I'm based at the University of Bristol, and my background is international development, but I'm interested in participatory way of approaches of research. And Jude and I are working on well-being and welfare and relational work, particularly focused on professional staff in academic sector. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. So the reason why I'm interested in relationship-centred practice is we're doing a piece of work around participatory research at the University of Bath, and one of the things we did a bit of a listening and scoping exercise initially, and one of the things we found out there was that we recognise that this work is very relational, but it's also potentially quite could be quite challenging, and so that's why we commissioned Jude and Tigist to do some work for us. So that's how we're sort of connected. So yeah, I think you've seen in the chat we're taking questions as you're going along. The format for today is a bit of a discussion between the three of us. Immy's got a few slides and tools and things to share as well as we're going along. So I would please put your questions in the Q&A function, and if you are not sure about which question to ask, upvote someone else's so that we can see which are the favourite questions that we can get answered. So, so to kick us off then, Immy, we've said already several times about relationship-centred practice, relational work. Tell us what are we talking about here? What does this mean?
Yeah, well, hopefully you can see my screen, and I guess I just wanted to start by exploring the question, what do we mean when we're talking about relationships? And in today's session, we're going to explore some of the challenges. And I think one of the first challenges we face is in trying to define what we mean by relationships. Relationships, the term does a lot of work. It covers a whole breadth of different types of connections, from the relationship I have with my sister to the relationship that I have with my bank. Clearly, I need very different things from each of those relationships. So when you start thinking about the role of relationships in the work that you're doing, I recommend spending a bit of time defining which types of relationships are particularly important to the work that you're doing and the things that you're trying to achieve, and then thinking about what characteristics they ideally need to exhibit to help to contribute to those outcomes. And we find when thinking about relationships, it can be useful to think about relationships in relation to transactions. And I think the first point to make here is that one is not inherently preferable to the other. There are situations and circumstances in which a transaction is entirely appropriate. So when I'm buying a train ticket, for example, I don't want a relationship. I want an efficient and effective transaction. But if I've got complex health problems, I need to have a relationship with my GP. A transaction will not suffice. And this diagram here just shows some of the characteristics that we often think about in relation to good relationships and good transactions. And there are a few characteristics that they share. So we think both good transactions and good relationships are fair, they are trusting, they are reciprocal, and they are reliable. But whereas a good transaction might be standardized, we think that a good relationship is usually or inevitably unique and somewhat organic. And whereas a good transaction might be defined by efficiency, a good relationship is more likely to be defined by empathy. And finally, whereas a transaction is often time bound, it might be a one-off interaction, a relationship is usually sustained, with each interaction building on the ones that have gone before. So I just thought I'd share that to kick this off.
Really helpful. Thanks, Immy. Jude, how does that resonate with the work that you do, either specifically the stuff that you're doing with us at Bath or in general?
Yeah, I think it resonates very strongly. The study that we've been doing with you at Bath in the context of the higher education sector definitely highlights the tensions that Immy's mentioned between these different types of relationships and transactions. And that's particularly critical for community-based research in contexts outside of the university, often complex, resource-scarce contexts. I think that the more transactional arrangements that are often incentivized by formal structures, for example, research grant conditions or due diligence processes or payment mechanisms, often get in the way of some of these longer term relationships, which are also equally essential to holding spaces within these contexts and ensuring that research taps into agendas set in these contexts. And definitely some of our participants spoke, I think you mentioned Immy just now, the sort of temporal nature of relationships versus transactions. And some of our participants in our focus group spoke a lot in temporal terms about slower, longer term collaborations, even friendships, versus last minute network building in response to funding deadlines, or feeling like you're part of the university machine, which can be really stressful and lead to anxiety and burnout as well in the context of some transactional work, but also when you're trying to fit in those relationships into those more transactional systems.
Yeah. Now, obviously, everyone here isn't going to be based in a university, and Immy's sort of talking about relational work in general, and so I'm be interested to hear the people in the room who, you know, do these ideas resonate? Are you sitting here going, oh yeah, I do relational centered practice, this is what I do, you know? So if you're here and this is resonating with you, love to hear from you. You know, I know it's a Q&A, but feel free to put some just comments in there, and we can share those with the rest of the group. But Immy, back to you if I can. So why is it so important? I mean, I think we've had some hints about this as to why it's important, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit more. And again, we're thinking about people in the room and thinking about why they may be thinking this is what they do and why it's important for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for many of us, we just intuitively believe in the importance of relationships. I think we've probably all got a story to tell about a relationship with a teacher that made a big difference to us at school, and maybe even played a crucial role in determining what we went on to study or do after school, or even the careers that we took up kind of longer term. I think sometimes when we're trying to make the case for relationships in a professional context, we can come up against a bit more resistance. But luckily, there's lots of really compelling evidence that we can pull on to make a really strong and compelling case. And I'll just share a few of these sort of little snippets, and happy to share more with anyone who's interested. I'll share a couple from health and then one from a different context as well. So many of you might have come across this. It's the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy recently has really been getting behind the kind of relationships agenda, and he's shared some research recently that loneliness increases the risk of premature death by almost 30%. So a really, really stark figure there that we can point to show the importance of kind of investing in relationships in our own lives, in our communities, and from a health perspective as well. Another one from a health setting from a few years ago now, so a longitudinal study of sort of nearly 3,000 women with breast cancer found that those with a network of good relationships were 4 times more likely to survive than those without. So pointing here to the real importance of relationships in helping us to recover and to walk through some of the most challenging kind of situations and periods of our lives. And then just one more that I wanted to share with you from a different context. Daniel Aldrich, he's based out in the States, has been doing some really interesting research on disaster recovery. And he and his team had a look at the impact of social capital or social connections on fatalities following the Japanese tsunami, and found that the strength of social capital was a more significant determinant of fatalities than the height of the sea walls. So it wasn't the sea walls or the physical infrastructure that made the biggest difference to the number of deaths. It was whether people knew who needed support during evacuations, who had a generator that they could draw on, who was in charge of various different things. So another really, I think, striking and compelling statistic there.
Great. Thanks, Immy. Jude, Tigist, anything from you in terms of that? I don't know if you've got statistics like that to share, but
no, I mean, again, from the research context, but I guess this is also relevant to contexts of activism or policy influencing, and especially any context that is in any way complex or uncertain, or when working with participants who are in any way vulnerable or excluded. I think strong and trust-based relationships are absolutely vital to ensure genuine engagement, and also to allow for responsiveness and flexible working. And we all know that. I mean, we're working in highly uncertain contexts, so being able to adapt relies on having that trust in place. And they can also be a huge source of inspiration and support and creative energy. I think our participants in our focus groups have really talked positively about the passion and excitement they feel when working very closely with long-term partners on transformative projects. But at the same time, several participants have also spoke about challenges. For example, when research relationships become too informal without clear boundaries, so that there's pressure to always be available, to be using, I know my WhatsApp groups have gone a little bit crazy, and it's difficult, especially when you're in those hybrid sort of formal, informal spaces, to know how to moderate that. And even more so when you're living in the same community as the partners with whom you have this relationship, you might bump into them. There's also pressure for staff often to invest their own personal resources when working in resource scarce contexts, which can be tricky to navigate. Challenges around continuity when relationship holders go on leave and have to rely on other people picking up those relationships as well, and potentially frustration when staff don't have the autonomy to meet expectations that arise through these relationships. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about the specific risks to welfare and well-being, which was the focus of the study.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm just checking our Q&A and there's no questions at the minute. So, you see, I say that. I'm going to read out a question, seeing as I was about to say if there's any questions. So we have got one from Mel here, who says, no, she's apologising because it's long, or they're apologising because it's long. So Mel has asked, how do you think we can get the challenges of combating loneliness and building social capital into the national adaptation strategies for climate? I struggle with how we get policymakers to think systemically about this and resource areas not directly linked with climate adaptation. As we know, these are cross-cutting issues of the community. Any tips? Immy, I'm thinking this resonates with some of the work that you just shared. So do you have any thoughts from the papers that you cited?
Well, I think it's such a good question and such an important question. And I think the more that we can show the link between strong relationships and the climate response, and how important it is to be investing in good relationships, both good local relationships and also good, what we call bridging relationships, so relationships between groups of people who don't necessarily see themselves as being similar to one another. You know, that's the way that we're going to be able to start making the case for relationships being really central to the kind of policy response. And there are different organisations who are starting to do really interesting work on this. Unbound, for example, are starting to think about how do we bring together the kind of migration space with the climate space, get conversations going between those two fields, and showing the importance of really thinking about social capital and relationships in how we can respond to what is going to be obviously an increasingly pertinent challenge.
Yeah. Thank you. Any thoughts from Jude or Tigist?
Communication is also central in terms of how we frame the challenge of in climate change, for example. The young generation, for example, do get it. Often they're backing in that and showing the power of the collective is also one way of thinking about how to combat that kind of and to show that they are not alone. There are a lot of people that are thinking in similar ways and opening up opportunity spaces for communities to come together, and like this one, they communicate also improves our work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks. And Mel, yes, Mel's just also said get in touch. So yeah, we're always encouraged. Well, I don't know. I always encourage people to get in touch after these things. So yeah, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I want to talk about it a bit more, then do drop us a line. Well, yeah, I think we're all reasonably easy to find. We'll probably pop some links in it towards the end. We can put our contact details in if we're interested. So, so for those of us who are new to this idea, I found that the people we've been speaking with at Bath have. The term relationship centered practice is new, but the practice feels very resonant, so we're developing a language there around what it is that we do and how we behave. And it feels like there's definitely some, hopefully there's some people here in the room who are also thinking, oh yeah, this is what I do. What have we got? You've given us a nice framework, Immy, about the difference between the transactional and the relational. Have you got any other tools or frameworks that can help us? I think the challenge for many of us is articulating this type of work, to advocate for it, and to say, yes, this is what I do. So yeah, do you have any tools or frameworks that you can share with us?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of what we're talking about here is nothing new. This is not rocket science. This is something that many of us, as I said before, intuitively believe in and do quite naturally, but we're often constrained in doing it by the context in which we're operating. So as you say, it's about having a language to talk about this way of working, being able to bring together and make a compelling case, and having an overarching narrative for why this sort of work matters, and then connecting with one another as relationship-centered practitioners to feel that sense of kind of solidarity and being part of something bigger. I often hear in the conversations that I have that being a relationship-centered practitioner can actually feel really lonely, because oftentimes you're working in a highly unrelational system, maybe with colleagues who think this is a load of fluffy nonsense. So if any of that resonates with anyone here in the room today, please do get in touch, come and have a look at the resources and the convenings that we hold as well, because hopefully we'll have something here that can speak to you. What I've got on screen here is just some of the tools and resources that we've developed over the years, and I'll share links to some of them in the resources tab in just a moment. But for example, we've developed a relationships heat map, which is an interactive diagnostic tool that helps you to identify the warm and cool spots in your relationship-centered practice, and then have a conversation with your team to identify practical ways in which you can kind of warm up those cool spots. We've also developed a Bridge Builders Handbook with the After Disasters Network, who are based at Durham University, which is a step-by-step guide for community weavers to reach out and build bridges across divides within the communities that they work alongside. And we also have a wide range of different reports which draw together some of the learning from the COVID pandemic and beyond, and which hopefully do some of that work in terms of building a wider narrative and sharing stories that can help us to kind of articulate this work. And then something else I just wanted to quickly share is something that we've been working on recently, which is what we're calling for now a framework for relationship-centered practice. And what this tries to do is to explore and share some of the conditions that need to be in place for this sort of way of working to become embedded. And what we've got here sort of at the heart or at the centre of it is a set principles or kind of values-based ideas which underpin relationship-centered practice, and which I imagine many of us in the room here today feel deeply. They're things like a commitment to fairness and a commitment to equity, those sorts of things. And then moving out a layer, we've got a set of behaviours, so the things that we do as relationship-centered practitioners and the ways that we behave, which helped us to nurture good relationships in our work. So these might be things as simple as showing up on time and doing what you say you're going to do, deep and active listening, those sorts of behaviours. And then enabling those behaviours, there's a set of knowledge and skills, which I think points here to the role of kind of continuous professional development, and even a role for our education systems in helping to prepare us as citizens to become better at relationship building. And these skills and knowledge might be quite general, so things like active boundary setting and working our way through disagreement in a constructive way, or they might be quite specific depending on the context in which we work, so something like trauma-informed practice, for example. And then the blue layer acknowledges that we are all operating in a specific context, as we've alluded to before, and that there are protocols and processes and incentives and support structures that sit around us in our work, which might enable or might inhibit the extent to which we can be putting relationships first and nurturing good relationships in the work that we do. And again, that points to a really important role that managers and leaders within organizations have to play in creating the conditions in which relationship-centered practice can become truly embedded in an organization or in a service. And then we've obviously got a set of external conditions that we are all operating in. So the economic, social and cultural conditions which have an influence on how we work and what we feel able to do. And some of these we as individuals obviously aren't able to influence, but here kind of pointing to the importance of policy, as Mel indicated in the chat, and much more. So I'll leave it there, but I will share some resources in the chat as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Immy. Jude, was there anything there that you, I mean, I certainly, think about the work that we've been doing, that a lot of that felt very resonant, and started picking up on some of the challenges that you were mentioning there, particularly that one about being a relationship-centered practitioner, but in an unrelational environment. So any other thoughts that kind of came to your mind as you were?
Yeah, I mean, I think so we decided that we would focus on a subset of higher education staff, members of staff, and that was professional and support staff, precisely because this group often occupy these relational roles, either explicitly because of the nature of their job description, or because they end up picking up these roles in the context of other work that they're doing, or because it's sort of landed on them by other people in the university. And when we're talking about universities, they're really, as you probably all know, really complicated ecosystems with a lot of kind of shifting parts as well. And I guess one of the things which has come up quite a lot is the recognition for these relational roles. They're often lower down on the hierarchy, that less well paid. They're often very gendered. They are often precarious, part-time roles. And so how do we actually value both the work the relational work that these members of staff are holding, but also the roles themselves? And that means ensure that there is sufficient time and resource given to the roles, but also that there is career development opportunities and opportunities for career progression as well. So that's sort of an area that we're kind of really focusing on. Mm-hmm. And looking a little bit at how those roles look different in other organisations and other sectors as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm just checking for questions. There's no other questions, but obviously we welcome them. So if you're sitting there thinking, what's going on? I just do have a question before, I know we're going to move on slightly, but one other question that came to my mind is that there's been various terms that have been used. So we've been using the term relationship-centered practice, and perhaps some of us would call ourselves relational workers or practitioners. Immy, you've used the phrase bridge builders, community weavers. Sometimes I've heard the concept of being a third space professional, or a broker. Are there any other terms that people might be they might be wearing that hat already, and actually here's a term that we could be putting towards our work. Are you aware of any other terms, and anyone else? So Immy, Jude, or Tigist?
If I may, the first thing we actually said is this concept of relational work even helpful at all? So that was what we were testing in our consultation. And do people understand their work as relational work? And if we look at the previous literatures historically, it's actually coined as a care work rather than relational work. These are people, whether they're social workers or in the medical sphere, it's their work that they do is caring for communities. So the early analysis in this area is turned in that way. But if we go back to one step back as well, is relatedness or relationship is also about positionality. And that does really matter, which brings us to talk about power and relationship in that space. But I can come back a bit later on in terms of people's sense of having power or not power.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments about identities, labels?
I think you covered a lot of the ones that I come across regularly: relational work, relational based practice, relationship centered practice. I think a huge range of different terms being used, and I think whatever works in your context, that's great. I did have another thought that has just escaped me, so I'll
that's all right. I'd love to hear from the people who are in the room if there's any terms that's in obviously in the environmental communication and environmental activism world, that if there's any terms that are used amongst this community, might be really interested to hear. So yeah, pop them in the Q&A. I appreciate that. I don't know if the chat, I don't think the chat's open, is it? But, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can as well. Okay. I've had a question that's come in, but I might just hold off on it. I'll ask you another question, a general one, that once we got planned, because it might come into the question that's come in from Anjali as well. So I feel like we've had a really positive framing around relationship-centered practice so far. It feels like it's something that we value, we care. It's it's great. Oh, sociocratic processes. Yeah. Thanks, Mel. Yep, I've just come across sociocratic funding models as well, decision making. Anyway, diversion. What are the challenges then? So so far so good, all positive. I think we need to get that right, but we, as we've said a couple of times that at Bath we were interested in the sort of in the welfare and well-being aspects of this type of work. But are there any other things that we should be cautious of? If we're going to start really embracing this and really kind of putting ourselves forward and developing our practice, what do we need to watch out for? And I don't mind who goes. Immy, did you have some? I think you had some slides for this one, didn't you? So yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we're really, really interested in. As you say, it's easy to think about the positives of relationship-centered practice, of which we think there are many, of course. But clearly there are a number of challenges that we face as relationship-centered practitioners. And we've been hearing from a wide range of different practitioners who've been sharing with us some of the challenges that they're grappling with in their day-to-day work. Some of these challenges are sort of technical or practical in nature. So things like, how do I develop safeguarding for relationship-centered practice? Or how can I develop the evidence base for what works? Or how can I measure and evaluate relationship-centered practice in a way that is sort of true to relationality, or in a way that doesn't reduce it down to simplistic statistics? Or how can we scale up this way of working in my organization? So lots of kind of technical and practical challenges that people are grappling with. There's also lots of sort of cultural and systemic challenges that come up time and time again. So how can we embed this way of working in kind of inherently risk-averse cultures? So thinking particularly of a lot of statutory services. how can we do this sort of work within systems that focus on rapid assessments and crisis work and prescribing? So thinking about that those organizational conditions that I spoke about before, when they're really sort of adverse or set up in a way that feel highly unrelational, how can we work around those? How do we shift cultural norms and kind of gain widespread commitment to this sort of agenda? How can we gain support for the early stage hidden work that's needed to build and root good relationships? How do we make sure that wider power inequalities are not replicated in the relationships that we build? So lots of sort of systems and cultural based challenges that we come across. And then finally, a set of sort of quite personal challenges that relationship-centered practitioners are often grappling with in their work. So how do we sort of understand boundaries and the place of intimacy in paid relational work? I often think of an anecdote that a teacher told me about how a child came to her in floods of tears, having really hurt himself, and all she was allowed to do was to turn him round, pat him on the shoulder and sort of gently push him away, because that's what sort of the school protocol said, and the sort of impact that had on her as she left for the day and kind of went through the rest of her week. Questions like, how do we establish relationships that are mutually beneficial when there might be a power imbalance or when there is an exchange of some sort? How do we have difficult conversations in empathetic ways? How do we work through conflict and disagreement in ways that are constructive and in ways that sort of center love and care? How do we work with despair and hopelessness? You know, thinking about people who are working in really, really challenging situations. How do we, you know, how do we kind of sustain as practitioners? How do we sustain ourselves through that work? And how do we kind of really listen deeply and listen in a way that is focused on understanding and not thinking about what am I going to say next and how do I respond? And Jude and Tigist, I'm sure you've got many more to share from your research as well. So it would be really interested to hear that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first and then Tigist if you want afterwards. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from the context of community engagement and participatory research, there is this risk that relational work, participation, it's very, very fashionable, it's very positive. We all know the benefits. There are obviously massive benefits, but at the same time, we're not really talking about risks and also what you need in order to overcome all the challenges that Immy has just picked up on. So I think in the context of the work we're doing around welfare and well-being, we have noticed and picked up from our participants on a number of risks, not least the additional time needed to accommodate all of this good, positive relational work and the support that you often need to allow for it. And the emotional energy, Immy talked about despair and hopelessness, given the crises that many of the people we work with are currently grappling with, and we as a country and we as a world in different places, and potentially the trauma in a research context of some of the subjects or topics that people might be engaging with, particularly in really challenging contexts, humanitarian contexts, under-resourced contexts, or with very vulnerable groups. And I think Immy also said this relationships are so complicated, so it means that you're often sort of navigating different ways of relating, different identities in different spaces. Our participants often, a few of them talked about having imposter syndrome and doubting themselves, so never being kind of sure of the right thing to say. This goes back to what Immy was saying about the tensions between sort of institutional norms and cultures and structures, and then what you feel you need to instinctively do to relate to somebody in a particular context. And then again, you raised the issue of kind of holding conflict, which is really challenging, particularly when you're working across a number of different types of groups, and particularly in our very kind of stiff upper lip British culture, where we might be quite uncomfortable with tolerating or sitting with conflict when things don't work out or when they break down, when people are upset, or when there are kind of fully fledged disagreements or arguments as well. And again, this position of this issue of positionality, which Tigist raised earlier on, the diverse backgrounds that different people bring into these relationships, and all the privilege or exclusion that entails. We're all coming to these relationships in different ways, as you've all said. And I think, I mean, all these challenges are surmountable with the right types of support, but in our resource-starved institutions, that support's often lacking. And where it does exist, it's often unequally distributed. So often those who need it the most are able or least able to access it. So I think, I mean, what we're looking at is responses to this. And the first step is mobilizing recognition for relational work and relational in the context of universities' roles, which might not be as recognized or as valued, but are essential for this type of work. And that's a conversation about proper resourcing and support. And it also means linking up with other campaigns around labour rights, around proper resourcing of mental health services. We know that that is often the first to go in our current policy climate. And it means that, as I think Immy said this earlier, or no, it's Mel asked this question about how you connect across different types of policy areas, priority areas. So there are allies in strange places, and often these struggles are part of bigger struggles. And then thinking about, like legitimizing careers and opportunities for progression, which again means resourcing as well. So so how do we connect across these spaces?
Yeah, great, thank you. Really comprehensive and good examples of some of these challenges. But I'm just going to pick up this phrase you said. Some of these are they're all surmountable, right? These are all things that we can overcome. But I'm going to go back to Angeli's question, because their question was, how do we think that developing a relationship-centered practice relates to the explosion of AI in our communications? So any thoughts on that? Because that does feel like quite a new challenge in this way of working. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, go ahead, Immy.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I certainly can't proclaim to be anywhere near an expert in AI. So I'm going to do the politician thing and slightly divert my answer, and instead share an idea that I'm really intrigued by, which is the concept of relational offsetting. So most of us here, I imagine, will be familiar with the idea of carbon offsetting, and you'll all be more familiar with it than I am. But what if we applied a similar idea to relationships? Now, again, I just want to caveat this by saying this is a very early stage idea, and I'm not sure what, there's going to be a lot of kind of risks and potential downfalls with it. So it's an area of exploration. But what if there were ways in which we could free up resource through the use of things like AI and technology in order to invest that additional capacity in building relationships in the context and situations and with the people who need it most? So recognizing, for example, that if I'm going to my GP's practice for a set of travel vaccinations, I don't need a full 7 minutes and a kind of empathetic, understanding relationship. I can just go in, have the vaccination and leave. But if, as I referenced earlier, if I have a set of kind of chronic and long-standing health, are you laughing? Yeah, sorry, 1 second, thank you. My neighbour's just offering to take it for me. So, relationships in action. Yeah. So could we invest, that extra capacity in the situations and contexts in which more of a relational and therefore a longer sort of time frame is required?
Interesting. Yeah. Jude or Tigist, do you have any thoughts about AI in this space?
I mean, I think AI is often presented as the opposite of relational, very kind of standardized, but actually, I mean, it is built on human relationships, and there has been sort of quite interesting work looking at whether computers can get depressed. And I think that we'll probably find that a lot of this type of practice is more human and more relational than it appears to be. And I mean, computers never exist independently of human practice. So sort of thinking about how we kind of bring in, whether it's algorithms, whether it's bias embedded in AI, whether it's different ways of using AI in different contexts, which might bring certain contexts and the prejudices those carry with it. I think sort of using a relational lens to look at how we're navigating AI could be really helpful. And I imagine that that is probably the way it's going in many spaces.
Great. Thank you, Jude.
Yeah, from our research, just trying, I don't know anything about AI, but in terms of just contextualizing it for our research, many of our the people that we consulted are time poor. They did say they are time poor, and AI might free up some space for that meaningful relational work to happen by freeing up people. Perhaps that's the very optimistic view of AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So maybe it's not quite so. Yeah, there's some opportunities there. So yeah, Anthony, thank you. Thanks for the question. We only have 5 minutes left, so do get your questions in if you want to ask any questions or any comments. Also welcome. So just for our last few minutes, oh, my screen's gone. I'm busy so listening to the conversation that my screen's gone. So in our last few minutes, is there anything that you really want to get across and say about relationship-centered practice? So, you know, I'm thinking particularly about the people who are in the room here with us. You know, a lot of them are going to be activists, campaigners. You know, so in some of the contexts, I can imagine that you've been describing quite hard, difficult circumstances. But is there anything that you want to say, or just give a little inspirational note for people before we go?
If I may go back to the positionality that we were talking about and power, and it's just to recognize people that there is a sense of agency when you are working in this space, but there is also a sense of helplessness that people are experiencing as a result of the tension they're holding. For example, they may hold a value, whether it's to do with climate change or with other things, and they are representing that communicative space. They are representing their organization perhaps, and there is a tension between their own values and what they are representing in that space, and sometimes not being able to make a difference, if you like. There is that kind of sense of helplessness being experienced by people. So there is a tension between the value we hold and the value other place. And final thing I would say is in terms of research, for example, I think earlier Immy talked about what we see and we can't change on the ground. You know, how do we train our researchers, for example? You know, if they are objective observers of a problem and they can't intervene, even though they are, you know, it's a power question there. Yeah.
Thank
from
you.
From an ethnographic point of view, for example.
Yeah. Immy's put her inspirational quote in the chat. If you want to change the world, start with relationships. Great. Okay. Jude, a last thought from you about relationships and practice?
just to build on that, I think, at the heart of relational work is that listening to difference. And I think being in this conference, even though we can't see everybody who's engaging with this session of environmental communicators and thinking about some of the things we've been looking at in that context is so helpful. And I think this opportunity to connect across different struggles, different areas, they're all so related. We have major challenges that we're all kind of engaging with. So looking for opportunities to listen and learn and continue engaging in surprising and often unexpected spaces is really helpful to us personally and also collectively.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Immy, you have less than a minute if you did want to say anything else.
Well, I just wanted to put an offer out there. Anyone who is looking to connect up with someone maybe from a very different sector or context to you, or even from similar, but who share these ideas and these beliefs, and would be happy to try and make those connections. And anything you're grappling with or anything that you think is missing from this space, please do let us know. I can't promise that we can solve it, but we can certainly try.
Yeah, Brilliant, thanks, Immy. So I will also just repeat that offer that if anyone's interested and wants to follow up in a bit more detail, always happy. You can find me, you Google me, Helen Featherstone. I'm at the University of Bath, and I can put you in touch with anyone who's here or just follow up. Will the slides be available? They can be.
Very happy to share them.
Very happy to share. So yeah, great, thanks. Really nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation, communicate. We should say thank you to Immy, Jude and Tigist, and it is 15:45, so we shall let you all go on to the next session that you're attending or taking a break. So appreciate your comments in the chat, thank you.